Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on the infrastructure levy. We're just going to wait for a minute or so before we kick off, just to give people time to log in. I probably ought to have some music for this bit, but I never do.
Just a couple of planning jokes would do, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because there are quite a lot of those, aren't there? Really funny ones as well.
You're tempting me, but I won't rise to it.
We could use the whole hour, actually.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's what our next webinar should be. An hour of planning jokes with some planning lawyers. Okay. So I think I've given it a minute. Are we all ready to kick off? And okay with that? Excellent. Okay. Anyway, good afternoon again, and welcome to this webinar, which is brought to you by Town Legal. In this session, this webinar, we're going to focus on a particular aspect of the proposals in the planning white paper, namely the proposed new infrastructure levy. I am your chair again today, Mita Kaur. I'm a partner at Town Legal, and I am joined again by a brilliant and learned panel. My luck never seems to run out in this webinar game, and they're here to obviously help us understand what the proposals on the levy say, the issues that it might raise, and so what may be in your future if you work in planning and development. So let me introduce them to you, starting with the sparkling Simon Ricketts, brilliant fellow partner at Town Legal. Say hello, Simon. The very learned Duncan Field, another of my brilliant partners at Town Legal. Say hello, Duncan. Well, they're all very silent today. And also another brilliant partner, senior statesman in the planning legal world, Mike Gallimore. Hi, Mike.
Thank you, Mita. Hi, everyone.
And having called them all brilliant, I'm now going to be enormously fickle and say I've saved the best person till last on the panel today. And we're also incredibly lucky to have a celebrity guest this time who needs no introduction, no run with it, Simon, honestly, other than to say Simon Gallagher, Director of Planning at MHCLG. Welcome, Simon, and thank you for joining us today.
Welcome. Thank you, Mita. I think you've oversold me there.
No, not at all. I hope you're looking forward to a grilling though from a bunch of planning lawyers. No, seriously, the prospect of a grilling by a bunch of planning lawyers is obviously something that has struck fear into the hearts of just about no one ever. So I think you're fine. Don't worry about it. Few housekeeping points. Microphones. Your microphones, if you're listening in, are automatically muted. You don't need to adjust anything on your own settings. We welcome questions. There is the usual Q&A chat function. Not sure if I understand the distinction. It's somewhere on your screen, and hopefully they'll pop up somewhere on our screens. What we're going to try and do with questions is try and hit as many of them as we can as we go through the various discussion points that we're going to go through over the next hour. If your connection is lost at any point, just rejoin the meeting by clicking on the same link that you used previously. So that's it in the way of housekeeping. So I think time to crack on, really. In terms of the format, I'm going to do a brief intro just to set the scene for where we are at the moment. And then we're going to focus our panel discussion around three broad areas where we see issues and challenges arising that we think need to be thought through if we are to arrive at a workable system. And we're going to put those to Simon. And ideally, we want a system with as few unintended consequences as possible. But let's see. So a brief scene set, I suppose, from me. I mean, essentially what we're talking about here is developer obligations, and the current system that we've got in place is this parallel system with some developer obligations being dealt with by way of Section 106 agreements and Section 106 obligations, and others by way of a levy, the Community Infrastructure Levy, that we all now know and love. Duncan, your face didn't twitch at all when I said that. Section 106 agreements, what are they? Well, they're binding agreements. They're entered into by those interested in land or landowners, to the rest of us, and local planning authorities. And they're usually associated with and required in order to release planning permissions in order to mitigate the impacts of development. The obligations have to meet statutory tests in order for a local authority to actually require them, and they come in a wide variety of flavours. Importantly, they are the agreements currently, well, they are the vehicle at the moment by which local planning authorities can require developers to pay financial contributions and also for securing delivery of affordable housing. But they also have a wide range of other types of obligations. I always call them do something obligations. So all these things that we are so familiar with, like car clubs, local employment provisions, open space provisions, etc., etc. But then running alongside that, we have SIL, or the who's sorry now development tax. It was introduced because, you know, we had years of dissatisfaction with Section 106 and complaints about them being opaque, uncertain, taking too long, etc., etc. So the intention with SIL was to produce a more transparent, certain system and one which would raise more for strategic infrastructure. Importantly, you couldn't spend it on affordable housing. But it was a £1 per square metre charge is a pound, behaving as though it's gone already, £1 per square metre charge on sort of a net increase in floor space. I knew it wouldn't take long, Duncan, but there are numerous exemptions. The regulations are notoriously complicated, they're inflexible, and they've been amended more times than we care to remember. So that's what we've got at the moment. What does the white paper say? I'm going to say this very quickly because clearly there's going to be much more detail in the discussion, but the proposals are to replace this existing parallel regime with a consolidated infrastructure levy, or IL. The levy would be a flat rate value-based charge set nationally at either a single rate or at area-specific rates, we don't know yet. It would be charged on the final value of development on the rate that applies when permission is granted, but it's not payable until occupation. I'm hugely encouraged by the fact that Simon G is nodding, so I've obviously got some things right at the beginning, which is great, and a thumbs up. So there's going to be a sort of de minimis, sort of minimum threshold below which the levy won't be charged. And importantly, it would be used to secure affordable housing. And that is actually where I'm going to stop, because I do want to move to the first area of discussion. And that area is really, I suppose, starting with the basics, the fundamentals. How will the levels be set, the rates be set? Who will set them? Will there be any opportunity to challenge valuations? What of viability in all of this? So I'm going to start by handing over to Mike. Mike, you were a member of the 2016 SIL review group. So can I hand over to you to kick off on this area to give us some observations from that perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Mita, and hello, everyone. I was a member of that group. It was chaired by Liz Peace. We reported in October 2016. And what I thought might be interesting is to have a look at some of our recommendations and just see how they compare with what the proposals are in the white paper. I think the first point to make is this is not easy. I think if it was easy, we all would have cracked it years ago, and we've been through lots of ideas, and the concept that we're going to come up with something that everyone buys into is clearly unlikely. So there's going to have to be some compromise somewhere on the line. So I actually think that a number of the recommendations in the review group report are quite similar to what is in the white paper, but there are also some fairly clear differences in terms of the philosophy, if you like. So our group concluded that development needs infrastructure. Developers who benefit from the added value created by development should contribute to the cost of that infrastructure. And I think that's pretty widely accepted. I think within the development industry, that is now accepted. We found that SIL was not working well for all the reasons, Mita, you've outlined. It's complex, it's uncertain in implementation, unintended consequences. Importantly, though, what we did say was that the exemptions and reliefs within SIL were causing real problems. And I think that's very relevant when we look at a new system. SIL hadn't worked well on large sites with complex site-specific mitigation. And I think, again, we'll come back to that when we talk a bit about 106. The review group did favour a system where developer contributions should be capable of being applied consistently on a national basis to provide a stable sort of regulatory and fiscal environment. And so that's, I think, a tick as between the two approaches. But what the group did say was that it was important to have some local flexibility to account for variations in local markets, local viability, and different types of development. And that's something, again, that we can perhaps come back to. I think one thing that was really important was to get communities to buy into development, particularly large-scale development. They had to see with some certainty what benefits were going to be delivered. And I think that goes well beyond infrastructure and affordable housing. You know, there are lots of benefits that are enshrined in 106 in terms of local initiatives, whether it's employment, training, local suppliers, you know, a whole range of things that are in there that aren't easily monetized. And I think, you know, that's important. And also the importance of the community seeing that infrastructure will be delivered in a timely way by the party who is best able to bear the risk of delivering the infrastructure. So I think there are some challenges there around that delivery with this new proposed system. So where we ended up was recommending a new levy based on values. So again, we're at 1 on the approach based on valuation. I think one of the things we grappled with was that it's pretty easy to set a value on a housing scheme based on final sale prices for individual homes. Where it became much more tricky was decide how to base valuation on other forms of development. So offices built for investment purposes, you know, industrial development, retail. You know, I can see that when you get to the valuation, there are going to be arguments there which need to be resolved. And, you know, inevitably you will need an arbiter unless value is going to be imposed in some way. And I think that does lead to perhaps one of the criticisms that there's been around the white paper, that it is very heavily focused on residential housing delivery. You know, clearly is fundamental, but also I think delivering other forms of infrastructure in a streamlined way will be really important going forward. Where we do depart is that the group recommended a low-level levy combined with continuing with section 106 for larger sites, because, you know, we thought that using 106 guaranteed that more substantial infrastructure for larger developments, and actually the developers being best placed to deliver it. So I think that's where the two philosophies start to depart. And the low-level really levy was needed, I think, to secure buy-in, to keep it simple, to remove exemptions and reliefs. You know, that gives you the opportunity to do that, and look at the 106 to deliver the heavier bits of kit. Having said that, we also thought a strategic infrastructure tariff, the mayoral type SIL, keeping that was a good idea for major and cross-boundary infrastructure. So again, that's in the white paper and was certainly something that we favoured, but it did depend on the levy being, as I say, at a low level. I think one of the interesting things that we looked at closely was how to get development away on smaller sites. And it's interesting that the figures we looked at, on dwellings of less than 10, of developments of less than 10 dwellings, 85% of planning applications fall into that category, or certainly did back in 2016. So 85% of applications for less than 10 dwellings, but only delivering 17% of homes across the piece. So we thought that actually the way to get smaller sites away was exempt them from the lit and from 106, apart from sort of essential site-specific infrastructure. And obviously the white paper is saying that the new levy would be paid by everyone. So I think that sort of, you know, flags up some interesting changes of approach. I think a couple of final points. One is as I say, any system based on valuations is going to lead to judgments having to be made. So what is the mechanism going to be for resolving them? That's going to slow the process down. And also that value is not going to be set until planning permission's been granted. At least with SIL, for most sites, you'll have a good idea of what your SIL liability is probably when you buy the site, certainly when you're putting your development appraisals together. Whereas with this new regime, you're going to have that uncertainty until after permission is granted. And I think that is going to make developers nervous when they're entering into their contracts from the land. So yeah, lots of questions. As you say, how is viability going to feed through when the rate is set nationally? You know, will regional variations in the market and land values be taken into account? Is it really possible to monetize all of the current planning obligations? Also the ambition that the levy is going to raise more than the current system of developer contributions. It seems to me that potentially is a big ask, particularly if Section 106 is going to continue in some form. And we've obviously got the footnote in the white paper that suggests it will be there. I've heard a few people suggest that perhaps it will be there in a more significant form than certainly some people have thought reading the white paper. So they're my thoughts, as I say, a contrast or comparison with the previous review group, and lots of challenges there, Simon G.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Simon, I'm sure you've got various things that you want to come back and say, but I know that I think you were quite keen to cover some of the fundamental elements of the proposed levy, and to emphasise its distinction in terms of how it's going to be set and how it's different to SIL. I want to park Section 106 for a moment, because we will come back to that at the end, because obviously that's, as a planning lawyer, that's close to my heart. But certainly, if you would like to talk about that for the moment in terms of rate setting, etc., and also the valuation point, because although I think this might be seen as a way to somehow try and get viability out of the picture, does it really do that? Does it just not push the valuation battleground to a different point in the process?
Yeah, so really good questions, and thank you for having that. And Michael has a great summary of the excellent work the SIL review group did. And I wouldn't underestimate some of the important bits that you haven't covered, which are less about the structure, but more about things like transparency, which I think are really important parts of the reforms that the SIL review group proposed, and which we're trying to get on with in the short run. And we do not need to wait for things, and I think those are really timely points. Look, just a couple of words on the structure. I think for those who are struggling to get their heads around the infrastructure levy, and I would include myself in that, I think the easiest way to think of it is as sort of an income tax equivalent, in that you get an allowance at the bottom, and then there is a rate that is applied to the value above that, and that is the sort of structure based on the value of income tax is how much earned, and this is how much the development is worth, and that's the sort of structure we're trying to get to. That makes it much less contested. I think, and I'll come back to a couple of points on the valuation, but I think it's worth sort of thinking about this as quite a fundamental change in the way in which we do development gain systems. You've got SIL, you would say, is based on a sort of pounds per square metre as the base of the charge. This is actually set on the development value at the end, and that is really big change. It also means that you change the timing, so it moves to the point of occupation sale, which I think is a big difference in there, and means that there's quite important consequences that flow from that. And I think also, and this helps answer some of Michael's points there, is that the base would actually be slightly broader than the current SIL, in that it would extend to not just new additional floor space created, but all development value there. Now, we've proposed in the white paper a couple of exemptions for self and custom built homes, but really tempting to broaden the base single rate. I think there's a really interesting question which is sort of in the white paper in there about whether those sort of allowances we talked about something for land values, and we talked something about average build cost. How much variation we need to do in that for different types of sites and different locations, and I think there's a really good question, and that's an area where I'm interested in views as part of consultation. But I just wanted to get a bit about the structure there, and then Mita, your really good question about valuation there, and I think Michael made some really good points about that. The key thing here is to get as much certainty for as much development as possible. It's not going to remove valuation in absolutely every circumstance, but actually the development value is, for a lot of sites, is the least contested part of it, because you know how much it was sold for if it was a home, and you know some of the rental values, and you can use established valuation principles to do that for rental side of things. There will be some where you need to have a bit of judgment, but I don't think, and it's generally not good policy making practice, to design your policy around the minority and the exceptions cases. You want to give as much clarity and simplicity as possible for the majority of cases. And the sort of the key thing here is that, and it comes across Section 106 and as well as SIL, is that if you're a smaller developer, these things are really hard to navigate at the moment. I've got an esteemed group of great planning lawyers here who find some bits of this community infrastructure levy complicated. So, if you're a small developer trying to navigate this system, it is really tough. If we can come up with something which is much simpler, which is much clearer about what the rates are and what your liabilities are, and that that if the value goes up, then it automatically adjusts. There's no need for renegotiation as the development progresses. That's quite a big simplification, and I think one of the reasons why we've chosen to base the levy around development value is that it automatically meets the test in our white paper of buoyancy, in that as values go up, you get more return. As values go down, you get less. You don't need to have renegotiation processes, and I think that is quite important and a big win for communities, because that sort of gap between what is negotiated and what is eventually paid is one of the real issues of lack of trust in the current arrangements, particularly on the Section 106 side of things. And so I think that is a really important part of the package there. Mita, is that a good enough first answer? And I'm sure you want to come back on a few bits.
Yes, thanks, Simon. Actually, I was going to ask Mike if he wanted to come back on any of that, given all the points that you just made, and obviously your experience from the review group.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up, Simon, on the point about the delivery of infrastructure. I mean, I think the idea that authorities will be able to borrow against anticipated receipts is clearly, a really good thing, and again, it's something that the group felt should be introduced. I think where some of the concerns are going to arise is then about the sort of expertise within authorities to deliver the infrastructure, them taking the risk, and the certainty of delivery when permissions are granted, because again, certainly on some of the bigger projects, and not just the very big ones, but significant schemes where I think to get buy-in at the decision-making stage from communities, them knowing what the benefits are going to be and seeing that they're bound into a contract is really important to them. And I know 106 gets bad press for not being transparent, but actually, you go to a committee meeting, most reports have pretty detailed heads of terms about what's going to be in the 106. I think we could do something about, that there is a requirement for the 106 agreement to be put on the planning register before it's signed. That's not observed very much. It could be, to give even more transparency. But I just worry that at the point of decision, there will be a promise about a levy to pay for benefits, and no one putting their arm up at that stage and saying, here's your guarantee that it's going to be delivered in a in a timely way.
Yeah, so I think this sort of, remember the infrastructure levy is really designed to be a financing tool, not the delivery tool, and the incredible work that local authorities do to sort of coordinate across multiple parties to get a deal on infrastructure is a sort of separate part of the process that we need to think about. And there's quite a lot in the white paper which is separate about how do we beef up that sort of convening and delivery function there. But the key point of the infrastructure levy is to provide a clear, predictable financing source which gets the money to do that. There are some real challenges then for everyone about actually making sure that happens, which nobody would pretend that the current system works perfectly in all areas on that. And you raised some really good points about capacity to do that. And I think the bit here we'd like to see more of, sort of, in a sense, local authority resource spent on actually doing that delivery, the coordination side of things, rather than haggling about rates and numbers, when we can make that much more predictable, much more certain through the process.
I think this is probably an opportune point, because the word delivery has been said several times in the last few minutes, to move on to the issue of delivery, actually. Because, I take your point, Simon, about, SIL being about sort of a funding tool. It's a way of collecting funding. But I think for those of us that work in planning and development, it's the whole life cycle issue, really. And for a lot of us, particularly, as Mike's mentioned, on large strategic sites, there feels like there's with SIL, there's a disconnect between collecting the money, there's so much noise around collecting the money, and the regulations are so complex, etc. But then it sort of falls off a cliff, and then there's this disconnect with how you actually use that money to deliver, and how that's worked out. And as Mike points out, this issue about the community actually knowing about it. It's even harder with SIL than it is with Section 106. So there's a piece there that needs to be picked up, particularly if you're pushing more into a levy, and less into a sort of more Section 106 type process. Sorry, I'm talking too much now, because I actually want to turn to Duncan to talk about all things delivery related, and to have some sort of introductory comments from you, Duncan.
Yes, thanks, Mita. I suppose the first thing to say is, I think, conceptually infrastructure levy is, attractive from a delivery point of view because of the potential certainty that it brings to the source of funding. But I suppose in the white paper, there were three things that sort of jumped out to me, which sort of raises sort of a few red flags on delivery. And briefly, I'm going to cover, the purposes for which the infrastructure levy can be used, infrastructure delivery, and affordable housing delivery. And I think those are some of the, particularly affordable housing, one of the key areas which I think people have raised concerns about, certainly in discussions I've had with others. So firstly, on the use of funds, white paper does suggest that the infrastructure levy might be capable of being used more flexibly for other council services, and even floats reduction of council tax as well. But it sort of qualifies that by saying, well, probably that would involve ring fencing a proportion for affordable housing. You'd still pay out the neighbourhood share, equivalent to the neighbourhood share of SIL that's paid today. And you'd also have to ring fence what white paper refers as core infrastructure obligations. I suppose my questions around that are, first of all, can we afford to do that? Because if this is a direct replacement for SIL and Section 106, there really shouldn't be anything left. On the other hand, if it's not a direct replacement and it's actually intending to capture more of the land value uplift, then that creates some of the transparency and governance issues that I think already beset the current system. So there's that on use of funds. Turning to infrastructure delivery, I suppose the key question I have there is around the later collection of receipts, because obviously it's dependent on realised development value, and the trigger for collection will be occupation. And and there's nothing to suggest really that this system will involve any, perhaps slightly fewer in terms of the comparison to 106, but they're still going to require quite a lot of time and resource for local authorities to collect the levy. So I think there's still a risk that infrastructure delivery is going to play catch up with development, because the local authority will be waiting for funds before they're willing to commit. And I know the white paper's floated a sort of borrowing solution, which would be borrowing against expected receipts. But I think, as the white paper concedes, infrastructure levy will be a mildly volatile source of funding, because it is dependent on realised development values and, in fact, development actually happening. And it's also only part of a pepper pot of infrastructure funding. So, local authorities or delivery bodies will still, in practice, have to coordinate other funds. So I sort of came away from the white paper thinking, well, forward funding of infrastructure is probably going to be as difficult as it is now. And perhaps actually, the only solution that immediately comes to mind is in-kind delivery, which almost brings us back full circle to where we are today. So, which can't be the intention of the white paper. So those were sort of the areas on delivery infrastructure. And then finally on affordable housing, I thought I'd pick up the point in the white paper where the aspiration to deliver as much affordable housing on site as there is today is sort of set out. And in order to achieve that, I think it suggests at least two approaches. One is to have a local mandatory provision for affordable housing, and then to offset the value of the discount from market dwellings against the infrastructure levy liability. And the second option is to have a sort of nationally set percentage of floor area over which local authorities are given the option of first refusal to take some of the dwellings as affordable housing, and then to offset the discount in the same way. I suppose the difficulty that it strikes me there is that both those mechanisms require the local authority to either make the mandatory provision or exercise its right of refusal before development value is known, and so you won't know the value of the offset, and you potentially won't know what other funds from the infrastructure levy might be available for funding other forms of infrastructure. And I know the white paper sort of recognises this, because it does float the idea of local authorities flipping units back to private market housing where those circumstances arise. But that creates a lot of uncertainty, perhaps from the developer's point of view, in terms of what the scheme will look like, and may also have, I think, possibly design implications as well. And I suppose the final area of concern was that, in the system we're used to now, rightly or wrongly, affordable housing provision tends to flex to accommodate perhaps, increased site costs or other increased need for other forms of infrastructure. And this system would seem to take that away potentially, unless you move away from the mandatory provision or the nationally set percentage of floor area for first refusal, and you allow local authorities just to use the money as they see fit to deliver affordable housing. But then, of course, it seemed to me that we risk going down a path of more off-site delivery and fewer balanced communities. So those were sort of the key areas which sort of struck me as needing quite a bit of attention from the point of view of delivery.
Simon, can I hand over to you now to perhaps come back with some thoughts on the whole delivery piece, really?
Gosh, and there's a lot in there, and Duncan, there's some very wise points. And I guess the thing here is to sort of focus on sort of giving the resources to the local authority that they can actually do some of the delivery and work out what the priorities are locally, and at the time of the development they can set the priorities and be clear about them. You're right about the key point about the timing difference here and the move for collecting the revenue at the end, and that puts some of the risk onto the local authority. The reality is that the risk is on the community and the local authority at the moment, in real terms, by what gets delivered. in that everything happens through a renegotiation route, and it depends on them being able to renegotiate effectively up and down. So I think in real terms, I'm not so worried about that, but you're right about the key point about the borrowing in advance of that and ensuring that local authorities are able to forward fund on the back of these receipts. The infrastructure they judge is being priority. Really going to emphasise the point, therefore, that Michael said about sort of priorities, about delivery, about skills and capability in local government to run that, which I think is going to be an increasingly important question. I think it also does allow, though, much more flexibility because, as you say, Duncan, the reality is Community Infrastructure Levy and Section 106 are some contribution to infrastructure delivery. It happens through a multiple of funds, and actually having a more fungible cash source, actually, I think will improve the flexibility to do that. I think it does need to be accompanied by a lot of transparency about what's going on there, because I think that is critical both for the community, who needs to know what they're getting and where it's coming from, but it also needs to get the confidence of the developers that the resources are being used appropriately. I think you've made some good points about the sort of on-site delivery of affordable housing and practically how to make this happen. And which is why, sort of in a sense, we are consulting on it. And I think the bit I'd sort of say is the government's aspiration is quite clear. You know, at the moment, we get a lot of the value in kind through Section 106 as a country. It's, you know, it's essentially 5 billion quid's worth of value if you look at our research on this. The government wants to get that, and it wants it to be on site. And so the question is, what are the best mechanisms of doing that, which provide the best balance of risk between the various parties there? I think we floated two options, essentially sort of, you know, the offset option or a sort of almost like a reserve price option. There may be another option out there, and if anyone's got a better way of doing that, I think that is well worth doing that. I think it does mean there's a little bit more valuation process that gets into there, and that's a bit of an irritant, but I'm not convinced that's sort of fatal into this. But we ought to be able to come up with a simpler and more straightforward approach there. And I think the bit I'd sort of just keep on going to, and there's been some good research on this that's come out recently, is about how long, on average, some of these sort of Section 106 negotiations are taking, particularly for some of the smaller developers, and that is leading to a massive cost of capital for smaller developers, which is really quite a serious issue. And I think, you know, something where they're taking some price risk because they know that it is dependent on the sales price value, but that's something they're taking anyway, and we can build that into there, and that ought to be able to really cut down some of the capital costs of development in this country in a serious way, which actually ought to be able to bring in some more people into the market. So I think there's a real prize out there if we can go for it. And I'm really encouraged, sort of, you know, if we've not come up with the best idea, and I'm very persuadable that we haven't come up with the best way of doing this, that there is actually a real prize here to deliver as much, if not more, on-site affordable housing through a simpler mechanism. And so if you can come up with a solution, please do come up with that.
Thanks, Simon. Can we just go, but before we move on, could we just go back to the issue of what local authorities can actually spend the money on? I mean, Duncan's already mentioned what the proposals say, but could you just give a bit more detail around that? Because obviously at the moment we've got, and it's a broad definition, to be fair, for SIL, we've got quite a broad definition of what infrastructure is. And, you know, some of the funds that get raised to go form part of the neighbourhood portion, which go off to neighbourhood 4 for them to decide how to spend. And, you know, I think what's happened over time is that it feels very much to a lot of people that this whole idea about raising funds for strategic infrastructure has very much been watered down. So I think there might be some concern that actually that's going to happen even more under this sort of consolidated levy type approach.
Yeah, and sort of the key watchword here is much more flexibility at the local level to decide what are the choices, what do they want between affordable housing, social infrastructure provision, hard infrastructure provision, and really those become the choices that are made locally rather than being made nationally. I don't want to, us to be trying to sort of mandate sort of shares of those. And those are things on which local communities are and local authorities are very good at making the judgment call on those, and the priorities of this. And the key we're trying to do is come up with what is a tool which enables them to prioritise between those things in a bit more of a flexible way than SIL and Section 106 do at the moment, which are end up, because it's multiple pots and we've tied up SIL in knots, can we come up with something that's slightly more sort of straightforward there? So I'm sort of, Mita, I'm slightly ducking your question, but it's a bit of an answer, which is we want to create a flexible pot which enables local authorities to use it on the things that are the priority for them, rather than being too precise from this end.
I wonder if one idea would be to still have the idea of an annual funding statement from the local authority, which after all has only just been introduced in relation to SIL, but gives additional transparency as to what the local policy priorities are, because it may be an element of cultural infrastructure, it may be, whatever the local priorities are, could be sort of, set out, not set in stone, but give an indication against which the authority could, be reporting, so that the community sees how these pots are actually divided up.
I think that's a great idea, Simon. One of the bits of the sort of the new and emerging regime that we want to roll forward is those sort of annual funding statements, which give that degree of transparency to the community on how revenues are being used and what they're being spent on. I think and essentially the model here is freedom to the local authority, but transparency and accountability to their community and what they're doing.
Mita, I know you want to move on. Can I just raise one question, which is a question that's come in, and just picking up on the point that's been raised about renegotiation of 106s, and just to sort of ask Simon what the evidence is on that, because I think there's a feeling that's a bit of a misconception. Obviously, when schemes change, there have to be variations in 106s to reflect that. But I'm not sure that we see evidence of developers just sort of going in and wanting to renegotiate for the sake of it.
I'm not saying they were renegotiating for the sake of it. Values change, times change. There's quite a lot of continuously full of some of these questions. So there's certainly quite a lot of renegotiation happening. I don't have the precise numbers of that. We don't. One of the merciful bureaucracies we spare you is telling us every Section 106 agreement and precisely what's in it and how many are renegotiated. I think that would be a slightly overdose of requesting for information as that things, but there, and particularly we know that it happened a lot, that as market values changed quite substantively. So I don't have a quite number, but I sort of challenge the idea that there's not much renegotiation happening out there.
Okay, I think this probably is the point at which we actually then go on to, the subject that is close to the heart of many planning lawyers, and that is obviously Section 106 and Section 106 agreements. Simon Ricketts, this time, do you want to kick off this last area of discussion for us?
Yeah, absolutely, Mita. I mean, we do joke about planning lawyers and Section 106, but to take a step back, well, first of all, we all think, if our home or office is on fire, what is the one document or item that we grab when we leave the building? For me, on the 12th of March, when we were told by the Prime Minister that we were going to be working from home, I can tell you for real, the only document I brought was the SIL regulations, because I knew that I just can't make sense of them on screen. And the promise of the SIL regulations was that it would reduce the emphasis and the complication and delays in Section 106. And the great sadness for all of us has been that it hasn't happened. Section 106, because it is such a flexible and necessary tool, has remained there. And that's not just in relation to affordable housing, but dealing with all the other things that Mita mentions, because obviously, you know, Section 106 itself sets out the four measures, the four things which Section 106 agreements can do. They can restrict the development or use of land in any specified way, can require specified operations or activities to be carried on the land, to require the land to be used in a specified way, or can require contributions to be made to the authority. And you know, obviously the proposal, sensible proposal in the white paper is that where there are commitments or contributions towards infrastructure, then they be dealt with by way of the Combined Infrastructure Levy rather than by way of Section 106 agreement. But although there's, you know, talk up front in the white paper of removing Section 106 obligations, I do accept that the proposals are actually that Section 106 will continue to operate so as to do some of those other things which are the business of Section 106 agreements, to regulate development, to make sure that it is acceptable in planning terms. I've got a few, you know, questions in my mind about how there will be this interaction between the Section 106 agreements that will remain and SIL, and then I've got some sort of suggestions and thoughts. I'll be very quick. You know, one big concern is about double dipping by authorities, intentional or unintentional, because that's been a huge issue with SIL. And I don't want to get back to the nightmare that was Regulation 122 and you know, trying to prevent things being secured by Section 106 that were the business of SIL. Regulation 122 was trying to rule that out, but then you had so many arguments and the risk of legal challenge that arose. I just worry how we deal with that interface. And the interface is quite difficult when you're not dealing just with financial contributions in a Section 106 agreement, but onerous financial obligations by the back door through you know, restrictions on occupation until certain elements of infrastructure have been delivered. So it's you know, how you really make sure that the value of those is either left for, well, is offset against your infrastructure levy liability. And so the way I see it is that, well, I do think there will be almost, I'm afraid, the same need for Section 106 agreements, but their role will change to an extent, because surely there will need still to be somewhere which documents the developer's requirement to provide on-site affordable housing and perhaps site-specific infrastructure, but then to go on to set out, hopefully in a standardized way, how the developer can offset against its infrastructure levy the shortfall in its you know, return from, you know, disposing of dwellings, being, you know, what the market value for that dwelling would have been, rather than as opposed to what it achieves from disposing of it to the registered provider as affordable housing. And so presumably and to effectively, or in law, give an option to the local authority or its nominated, and through the local authority to its nominated registered provider, to take units within the scheme and setting out the rate at which, or the value which is to be the basis for the option to be exercised. So I do see that there'll need to be some sort of agreement, which may as well be the Section 106 agreement, which sets out all of that. And associated with that, either on a standardized basis or in the agreement, we'll need to work out how we deal with valuation, the valuation of the units as affordable housing or as open market, checking as an anti-abuse measure that the costs of infrastructure which are being claimed by the developer are appropriate, and then also dealing with some of the complexities of phased developments and such like, because sometimes you'll get to a position where you're paying the infrastructure levy on occupation, but you may well not have disposed of all of your affordable housing units by that dwellings by that stage. So how you recover your cost. The final thing I was just going to say is, assuming we are still going to have Section 106 process in some shape or form, I really, really think that for the last 10 years or more, we could have made this process faster through simple measures. First of all, having an updated, standardized template for the agreement and most of the mechanisms that are frequently deployed. And it's, appalling that we have an out-of-date 2012, I think, template that no one uses at the moment. And we should have, much tougher guidance on the requirement for Section 106 agreements to be much more well advanced before schemes go to committee, based, as is often the case in some authorities, on drafts which can be submitted, pretty much when applications are with the authority. So, let's not just take the delays of the Section 106 process as a fact of life. There are things we can do about it that don't need legislation. It's just that, we just haven't done it. We thought that, this thing dear to my heart would reduce the focus on 106, which it hasn't done.
Thanks, Simon. Simon R. Before I hand over to you, Simon G, can I just throw something else in there to add to the list of what Simon's just said, and it is really the most obvious one, and something that I think does come out in the research that MHCLG commissioned that was done. I think it was from January, but it came out at the same time. I think he published it at the same time as the white paper proposals. Lots of people saying actually we do quite like Section 106, particularly for large scale sites. It gives us flexibility that we want. Yes, it takes too long, but actually that's about resourcing. And if there was better resourcing of local authorities with planning officers that had time to sit down and actually focus on those, including and planning lawyers in-house as well, that actually, yeah, I know, always looking for jobs for the lawyers. That actually that's also one of the things that would really help with a lot of the issues around delay. And sorry, just before I also hand over to you, just another thing, in terms of looking for solutions, a lot of the things that are talked about are the fact that, small, and you've mentioned this, small developers are the ones that struggle, and it's their developments that are being held up, and they don't have the resources and the know-how, etc., etc. So shouldn't we really be looking for a solution that streamlines or gets rid of something like Section 106 or whatever, for those smaller developers and smaller scale development, but leave the other tools in place for the larger scale development that needs that degree of flexibility? Yeah, because ultimately lots of developers do like it. And actually, what about local authorities? I think there are a lot of local authorities that think that still in Section 106 work quite well for them, actually. Sorry, over to you.
Sorry, can I just chip in on that last point? It was interesting. So the review group got a lot of evidence from local authorities who said, actually, we're pretty good at negotiating. We've done some good deals over the years. You know, we can fight our corner. Thank you very much. And you know, that they were confident, quite rightly so, in their abilities to negotiate good 106 agreements for their communities.
Look, there's a lot in there, and you know, in a sense, this is why we're consulting to get some of these views, and I expect we will get quite a lot of the sense that the current system works very well. The bit I want to just make sure that we are also hearing is, and Mita, you've mentioned it, is there are a number of people for whom the current system does not work well, and that includes some of the smaller developers. You know, if I had sort of a small sum of money for every time I've had somebody grumbling to me about the time taken to get Section 106 agreements and you know, uncertain things, you know, I would be able to actually sort of properly pay some of our collective Section 106 bill. You know, I think there's a bit of a bias in this to hearing from those in the system who are happy with it, but we shouldn't forget that there are people who find the current system incredibly complicated to navigate. It is time consuming. If we can come up with a simpler system, which is, you know, much more rate based, then I think there is a big prize out there, and let's have a collective run at it. And Simon's listed a number of, you know, really important areas where we would need to do some work in there to work out the detailed arrangements. I think the bit I'd sort of just, you know, that way lies sort of the SIL regulations if we're not careful. And I think there's a bit that, and you know, picking up something Mita picked up earlier, is let's sort of keep ourselves back to the objectives. There will need to be some complexities because life is complex and different development is, but you know, we don't have to reinvent everything that is in the SIL regulations in order to do this. You know, Simon was more noble than me. When the instruction of work from home came out, I grabbed my national planning policy framework rather than my SIL regulations, which says something about my geek status. But I think there is something that in there that I sort of do want to sort of hold to, and I think it's worth going through the process and asking ourselves, can we make this substantially simpler? You know, it is a complex area. I think it is very clear, and Simon said it there, that we are going to need a form of Section 106 to do those ongoing agreements on who does what, and and you know, I think Mita, you had a fantastic term for this, which I have forgotten now, but which is really a key powerful tool of the Section 106 agreement. They're probably being asked to do too much at the moment. Yes, they're flexible, but they're being asked to do much. What we're trying to do is get out the bit which is the sort of the value collection bit, put that into a sort of a levy, and then allow Section 106 to get on with doing what it does best, which is working out those agreements with it as a flexible tool. And I'm, you know, hoping we can end up with something which is in a sense much more focused, because it's actually just on roles and responsibilities and who's doing what and whose ongoing functions are, rather than being a debate really about money. Which we should be able to make much more predictable for a lot of parties. So I'm sort of, I think we can come up with a. I think, you know, Simon's raised a whole load of issues there. We deliberately kept the white paper at a relatively high level, because if we'd have started getting into this stuff, we'd have ended up with 200 pages. We're going to have to come back to some of those questions. A lot of those do need working through. There are bits of complex, and I think the sort of challenge from my point of view is to sort of unpick the onion of this one stage at a time, rather than trying to get to the middle core before we've actually worked out some of the outer layers first. I've seen a question which says I got my analogy with tax wrong, which is embarrassing. I should have probably used corporation tax, which I think is a better analogy. And I'm now using another analogy about onions, which is probably not a good one either, but I hope I'm trying to sort of use a few pictures rather than get ourselves into too much technicalities.
Could I just make 2 points, or one of them maybe a question, picking up 2 questions that people have raised, and I've realised we haven't probably covered it enough. One point was a lot of Section 106 obligations are actually just driven by the development management policies in individual plans, and every authority has its own preferences, etc., which, you know, has its benefits. After all, that's localism, but it has its complexities. So I'm taking it that the idea that there'll be nationally standard development management policies may make all of that more straightforward, and some of it may just be able to be dealt with by way of condition rather than getting into agreements. You know, great for, you know, smaller schemes. That was one point. And then the second point was, you know, not on the question of Section 106, but is back to sort of the setting the levy on individual developments. And, you know, at least 2 people have said, well, you know, how do we arrive at a way of setting the value which I suppose is sufficiently sensitive as between areas of, you know, high market demand and low market demand, and you know, how do we make sure that development isn't more difficult on or less attractive on brownfield sites than greenfield sites? And if you have a standardized rate, surely you know, in Westminster, schemes are going to be super profitable as opposed to areas of more you know, more precarious viability. I just thought we probably needed to have a couple of minutes on that.
Yeah. Well, look, and the research that Mita referred to shows that at the moment, the current system really focuses its resource gathering on the high value areas, and there is sort of no getting around that at the current system. So I don't want anyone to think that that we're sort of introducing a problem into that one. That is a function at the moment. That the vast majority of the of Section 106 across the country is collected in the highest demand areas in the London and the South East. It really doesn't play a big role, for example, in most of the North East authorities, and you know, so I'm not sure that redistributive effect of this is actually a big problem, although something we're very alive to making that. I think the bigger question, which is what I mentioned earlier, is in working out what the sort of the build cost allowance is, whether we need to, how much flexibility we need to introduce into that, because I think, you know, on the one end of the spectrum, every site is different. Every site has different costs. You can introduce something sort of almost site by site, in which case you've lost all the beauty of the simplicity and things. On the other hand, real world is a bit messy and complicated, and things aren't all exactly the same. And so we might need to introduce a couple of bits. I think that's one of the questions we particularly want views on in response to consultation on this one, because I think that's quite an important area there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Simon and Simon. I'm conscious that we're actually just run over time, so I just wanted to put one final question to you, Simon G, which was really what are the next steps in the process? What's going to be happening in terms of developing this particular aspect of the proposals, because there is quite a lot there to figure out, I think.
That, I think, Mita, is one of the best understatements I've heard of the day. So we are consulting up until 29th of this month, so that's another three and a bit weeks. So if you haven't got your representations in, get them in. We're looking forward to receiving those. We're going to have to digest those, and those are representations across a number of areas. I hope what you've got a sense from this is the point that what we have put out is a very high level proposal, and it needs a lot of detailed working through. Those of you who know enough about the law in this area will know that there's quite a lot of primary legislation that would be needed to introduce something along these lines. So it would take quite a bit of work to get us to primary legislation. What I hope we're able to do, but we'll have to specify this all in more detail down the line once we're through this phase of consultation, is have a much more iterative phase of work over the next while to develop the individual elements of the white paper, because I think that's a you know, we're going to need to get consultations on the detail of all of these elements, and I hope what we can do is a bit more discussion, which is more like this format rather than us produce documents and people come back and say nah. And that's not the most useful way of having an interaction. And I hope what we can do is have this. But I think that depends on, and this is where I'm going to do a slight plug, is that sort of it's going to need to be, okay, how are we going to make this work? What does this do? What does this do? And we'll get through from the stage of thinking, yeah, what do I think about it? Do I like it? Do I not like it? Into the, okay, how do we make this work with the real world of the developments that you're dealing with, and in the places where you're working.
Brilliant. I mean, I think. Oh, sorry, it's been plunged into darkness. One sec. Yeah, I mean, I think I hear what you say about the proposals being high level, but I think the interesting thing about that has been that it has resulted in there being an awful lot of debate and discussion, you know, in the industry. And I think, you know, as an industry, we should be making sure that we do come back and respond. And I'm sure that we will all look forward to the opportunity to to keep doing this again and again with you, Simon. You'll be glad to hear. But on that note, I think we have run over time, so I think it's time to close. And thank you to all the panel, Simon, Mike, Duncan, and our celebrity guest, Simon Gallagher. Very kind of you to take the time today.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Simon.
And a big thank you to all those watching. If you joined to listen today, I hope you found it as interesting and as educational as we all did here on the panel. Other than that, good night. And as I always say at this point, it's wine o'clock really. So goodbye.